Well, after all these years, it's time to bring this to an end. The final Poseidon movie review. And while I'd love to stretch this cash cow out into more videos, there isn't any more movies I can review, except for that one, which I did say that if I got 1,000 likes on any one of my reviews, including this one, that I'd do Beyond the Poseidon Adventure. Please don't make me. Anyways, with that said, it's time to move on to the last movie of the Poseidon series, Posiedon, 2006. And this one's pretty interesting. While the last two movies had the exact same name, and even the similarly named characters and similar traits to the first movie, this one took things in an entirely new direction, and it's pretty unique for that. I mean, of course, since it's not a B movie, it does return to the original tradition of hiring a ton of main Hollywood actors in order to get its marketing up, but overall, I think the actors are actually really well cast in this movie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What is the non-spoiler roundup of this movie? In this movie, we are introduced to the Poseidon, a fictional ship that is an ocean liner sailing from presumably London to New York, as mentioned by one of the characters. And during one of the New Year's celebrations on this ship, the ship capsizes, but people in one of the ballrooms end up surviving the capsize. And this movie follows some of the survivors as they attempt to make it out, but not all of them do. This movie was primarily directed by Wolfgang Petersen, who also created movies such as Das Boot and The Perfect Storm. Basically, this guy is a ship movie director, which is why I love his movies so much. Although granted, I haven't seen Das Boot because it's in German, and I haven't seen Perfect Storm because I don't know. Maybe I'll make a review on that next, who knows. Anyways, I actually have some interesting behind-the-scenes stuff about this movie. No, I did not talk to Wolfgang Petersen, and no, I do not have footage from behind the scenes. But I do have some interesting information that I'll share later in the video that I don't think has ever been shared online, so stay tuned for that. And, interestingly enough, this would actually end up being Wolfgang Petersen's last major movie, as he died in 2022. I really wanted to somehow find a way to talk to him for this video, but I was not aware of this, sadly. So, does this movie hold up to the original? And does it deserve to be called the greatest of the series? Well, first of all, no, but still, let's get into the movie, and from here, spoilers ahead. So the movie starts out somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic, where we see our hero and the ship itself. At this scene, it then zooms in into a shot of Dylan running. This will basically be our Reverend Scott character, and basically every movie has their one guy that sort of saves the entire group. But the 2005 and 2006 ones don't really have that. I guess it's more of one person saving the group with one more person by his side. In the 1972 version, this was Reverend Scott and Rogo. In the 2005 version, this was Rogo and Bishop. And in this movie, it would be Dylan and Ramsey, or Robert. I'll talk about that later. Then, after going through the ship, which, side note, if you look at the funnel, has a P on it, so I can only assume that the company that owns this ship is a one-ship company. This is their only ship. Maybe they're like Poseidon Cruises, or Poseidon Voyages, or something. I don't know, but it's a weird little tidbit. But, anyways, we see Dylan again and look out onto the water, then we go inside the ship to one of the suites. Then, in the suite, we see our main couple of the movie, Jenny and Chris. They are a young couple who we never see their age, but probably 20 or something. Jenny's dad, Robert, was the former mayor of New York and a firefighter. You will never see those come up in the movie other than like one point. So yeah. Anyways, he gets back into the suite, and we immediately see that, well, his relationship with Chris isn't exactly the best. And he sort of tolerates him just because, well, he's his daughter's boyfriend and he doesn't want to screw anything up. When he comes back, he immediately talks to them about ground rules for the room, because he did buy the room and he says that technically they still live under his roof. Jenny, being all mad about him being bossy and controlling, goes up to her room. Side note, you'll see this giant, sweet room in the top of the ship. All of the sets in this movie are real, they are not CG, so they did build that expensive bedroom onto the second floor and used it for a split second of one shot. I feel very bad for anyone who tried to keep costs down while making this movie. Then we get a funny scene where Ramsey asks Chris if Jenny is like this with him, to which he just says no in a very awkward way. Then we go into the hallway where we get introduced to another character, Elena. You will see these characters' stories get evolved throughout the movie, but just to make things a bit simpler, she's a stowaway who's trying to see her brother in New York. We then go into the atrium, which, yes, is also real. This is also not CGI. Anyways, Elena is wandering around the atrium when she bumps into Dylan. She then asks for directions to the galley, to which Dylan looks a little bit confused because that's off limits to passengers, and also, she should have came here when she boarded the boat. Why does she not know where to go? But he doesn't question it and tells her where to go. We then get introduced to another confusing character, Nelson. He's calling someone who, I think, I've heard people say is his lover? I've heard a lot of people call him gay, or say that he's a gay character, but we never see this throughout the movie, so I don't know if this scene is what it is. Anyways, he's asking his, whoever's on the phone, to call him at midnight for old time's sake. This will come up later. We then cut to Helena, who finally found her way to the galley, and someone named Valentine telling her she was supposed to stay inside the cabin, but she says that the TV is broken and that she's bored and going crazy, which makes sense, especially if it's an inside cabin. I don't know what cabins the crews get on this ship, though. He then tells her that he could lose his job for this, meaning that he probably snuck her on board the ship, and he's the reason she's here. He then gives her food and tells her to promise him that she won't go outside of the cabin again. She is lying. Then, with all our characters introduced, we see a beautiful scene of the ship sailing at night on New Year's Eve. We then get the captain of the ship giving a speech about how cool it is to be on the back of Poseidon, celebrating New Year's. Then, a singer comes on and starts singing. We then cut to a table where we see Dylan, Ramsey, and another character named Lucky Larry gambling, and Dylan putting in some very risky moves. We then get to exposition dumps, Ramsey saying there's more money in here than his father made in a year, and Dylan saying happiest time of my life was when I was broke. Again, this is a problem the movie has with telling us things about the characters and then never bringing up those things ever again, or at least rarely doing so. I would love to hear more of these characters' backstories, but that's not what we're gonna hear. We then see Jenny and Chris come over and tell him that they're going to go down to the nightclub for New Year's. He then says for her to do up at least one more button, and that he doesn't like what she's wearing. Of course, this is another point of conflict, and we'll see these two argue quite a lot over the movie. You can kinda just tell what's going to come. One of them is going to die, and right before they die, they end up loving each other. We then cut to a kid named Connor, who's a new character, playing on one of his, I think, PS portables, and then running into Dylan as he drops his chips. Maggie, who is Connor's mother, then comes over and asks Connor what happened, to which he jokes, "Wasn't looking where I was going." Maggie then introduces herself to Dylan, and this is another big part of the movie, because I don't think these two know each other before the movie, but then they start talking about things that happened in their past. Then, after that, they introduce each other. Maggie says, Maggie James, Dylan says Dylan, and then, after they talk for a bit, and Maggie flirts with Dylan, she says, bye, first name Dylan, but she might have said his last name if they knew each other before that. This is just really confusing, and I do not know what these two's relation is to each other. We then cut over to the previously mentioned nightclub where Jenny and Chris are, and Elena joins. Once again, she has broken out of her cabin. We then get another confusing exposition where I don't know what's going on. Nelson orders a $5,000 bottle of wine from 1983, and everyone else is really shocked, but he says, "My treat, carpe diem." Then he says there was no work crisis, and that I was the one that missed the boat in London, then recites some sort of song or poem or whatever, to which everyone is really confused by. I do not know what his previous occupation is, who these friends are, and all we know is that he's apparently an architect, but this only comes up once during the movie and you'll see this. Now, throughout this movie, we get the impression Nelson is suicidal or something is going on in his life, and that this is his last sort of, I don't know, thing with his friends, but I could not find the poem that he recites, and I just could not figure out what was going on. Anyways, we go back to the bridge where we get the main part of the movie. They're all singing Auld Lang Syne when the acting captain, or the first officer, feels that something is off. Back in the ballroom, everyone is counting down, and it finally turns to New Year's on the high seas. And, just like the 1972 movie, we finally get a scene that happens before the ship flips over. Oh, spoilers, by the way. Outside, Nelson checks for that call that he mentioned earlier in the movie, but receives no call. I don't know what this signifies other than maybe no one really cares about him or whatever, and Nelson seems to echo this statement, throwing the phone into the water. We then go back to the bridge where the first officer grabs his binoculars only to see what was described in the first movie as a wall of water coming towards them. He then realizes that a massive rogue wave is coming straight towards the ship and tells everything to turn to the starboard as much as they possibly can. Nelson, almost throwing himself over the ship, looks and sees the wall of water, and I don't know why, but instead of killing himself like he was trying to, he sees the wall of water and runs back into the ship. The crew of the Poseidon turn the ship, but it is no use. The wave is drawing near, and the ship is about to be hit. They then ring the general alarm and stop the New Year's party in the ballroom, with everyone immediately doing exactly what you should not do when there's a general alarm on a ship, freaking the hell out and running around everywhere. They tell the passengers to brace for a medium and heavy roll, and they call an SOS. However, they know that nothing can be done. The wave strikes the Poseidon on her starboard side, and in a shot that is extremely impressive for 2006 technology, they roll over. And, of course, like I said, it's extremely impressive that in 2006 they were able to portray water this well. Even the 1972 Poseidon and 2005 Poseidon couldn't do it that well. The ship begins to capsize in more scenes that I can only describe as absolutely breathtaking. A lot of this movie is literally just eye candy. Anyways, a giant piece of lights rips across the deck in the ballroom and traps Chris underneath it. A crane swings through and knocks out people in one of the areas of the ship. And in the kitchen, knives and cutlery go everywhere as the ship begins to capsize. The engines are almost ripped out and begin to short circuit, and the ship rolls to full 90 degrees at this moment. There is no way that it can recover. Okay, I don't need to describe every single element of this capsizing. You get it, it looks amazing, graphics are great. Anyways, in the ballroom, Chris falls and is trapped under the lights. Then we see that people actually fell out of the ship, and that the ship is almost completely upside down by this point. The elevator then falls in the atrium, wedging itself in between the two areas, which will be important later, by the way. But what's this? Is the ship rolling back over? No. The extremely destroyed ship begins exploding, because a tradition in Poseidon movies, random explosions. These random explosions, surprise surprise, fail to help anything, and Poseidon loses all stability, flipping completely over, with many of the lights in the ship going out. And in another beautiful eye candy shot, the Poseidon goes silent. Or so we think, because the emergency lights then switch on, and light is provided to people in the now completely capsized Poseidon. Flashing back to inside the ship, we see that, for some reason, there's a lot of survivors after the ship capsized. In real life, at this point, water would go flooding in and basically kill everyone in the ballroom. But here, there are a lot of survivors. However, fires have broken out and there's a lot of injuries. Meanwhile, downstairs, which is now upstairs in the nightclub, the drunk teens have gone into full-on panic mode, which is also the last thing you should do when faced with an extreme survival scenario. However, Jenny, Chris, and Elena are all still alive. Jenny looks for Chris and finds him pinned under some metal. Jenny tries to lift it but cannot get Chris out of his predicament. So, she asks for help and grabs the first person she sees, Elena, who agrees to try to help them lift the metal. But, as they're lifting the metal, something happens, and I don't exactly know what happens, but from what I can see, the water on the roof of the ballroom gets electrocuted, frying everyone in the ballroom except for Jenny, Chris, and Elena, for no reason at all. Meanwhile, back in the ballroom, they're still looking for Connor, and although this movie mostly departs from all of the typical tropes of Poseidon, they have to have one of them, and that's someone stuck on the roof. Maggie finds Connor on one of the pianos, which is flipped over and he's still on. Since it's bolted to the ground, it isn't gonna fall anytime soon. Robert has the idea to have him jump into a curtain that will catch his fall. He says he used to be a fireman, and that's why he knows this works. Now, you'll see this fireman thing never appear in the movie except for one other part, which is something I have an issue with. Back in the ballroom, they realize that they can't lift it alone and that they need something to leverage it, something like a metal bar or whatever. Jenny tries to find something, but Chris stops her, saying that she should stay with him. Elena then volunteers to go and has to climb over all of the bodies in order to find one. Back in the ballroom, the captain gives a speech to everyone who's still alive, telling them that apparently they were struck by something known as a rogue wave, and he mentions that EPIRBs were sent out to send distress calls. Now, this is a real thing in real life. When one of these devices submerges and detects water, it immediately starts sending a signal, meaning that the entire world will know where they are, and saying that they're at most several hours from rescue, so everyone freaks out and starts asking how they get to the lifeboats. But not everyone is sitting idly around. Dylan goes around and looks for stuff from bodies and finds a knife, a flashlight, and a few other things. Connor then goes over and asks him what he's doing, to which Dylan replies that he's gonna get out, through the bottom. Then, Connor says, "How will you get out there? That's the part that's all sealed up." He's talking about, well, the fact that since a ship needs to float, there's no holes in the hull and no doors to get out, but we'll see this be not true a bit later. Meanwhile, Ramsey is talking to the captain and asks him how to get up to the nightclub. But the captain says, well, if everyone's dead up there, then their daughter is dead too. However, he is determined to get up to find Jenny, not so much Chris, and says that he'll go up no matter if the captain wants him to or not. As Dylan is beginning to climb, Maggie comes and Connor tells her what Dylan said. Maggie tries to tell Connor that they can't get out through the bow thrusters, but Dylan is persistent, saying that he indeed can get them out through the bow thrusters. Then, Ramsey comes over, and he also is listening in on what Dylan is saying. Then, the old guy, Nelson, comes over and says that ships weren't designed to float upside down and that staying here is pretty dangerous. By the way, I still find it strange how they keep on giving all these characters quick backstories whenever it's convenient. They mention Nelson as an architect, but they will never mention that through the entire movie. yes, I will keep complaining about this through the entire thing, because it is a big problem with this movie, is just that it is so rushed. Dylan says he works better on his own, to which Ramsey says, well, we're coming with you, and asks one of the workers there where the service stairs are. Ramsey agrees to pay him 10 times his yearly revenue if he comes with them, and so, with our team assembled, they begin heading up the ship. Maggie then also reluctantly joins, and Nelson comes too. People see them climbing, but the captain still tells one of his crew to seal the doors, which, by the way, why are there watertight doors sealing off the atrium from everywhere else? Feel like that's a bit strange. But, anyways, everyone climbs into the kitchen to find the service stairs that can lead up. However, there's too much junk in the way and they need to sort through it. But the doors close behind them. There's no going back. Meanwhile, in the nightclub, Elena is climbing around, praying to God to keep her safe, when someone grabs her hand out of the pile of bodies. Lucky Larry, who survived the capsize and has a metal bar to help get Chris out. Though I will say I find it weird that he's in the nightclub where all the teenagers were when he was at the gambling table not long ago. In the kitchen, the gang are trying to find the service stairs. They find them, but there's too much debris and fire in the way. Then, Dylan has a pretty dangerous idea. Go through the elevators and get across there. And if he can get across the elevator to the other area, there's more stairs across. Dylan opens the elevator, and we get to probably the most terrifying scene of the entire Posiedon franchise. The elevator scene. The part that single-handedly made me have nightmares for weeks, and that's not because of this scene right here, it's because of a little bit later. They find a metal table and swing it across. They will use that as a bridge. There is a small area on the other side that they can connect the table to, so it works as a very unstable and dangerous bridge. You will see the dangerous and unstable part come to play later, but anyways, Dylan crosses the bridge and tries to open up the elevator door. However, he can't get it open. But then he sees above them the elevator door there is completely open. So, if they can boost them up to there, then they can get out. Dylan, Nelson, and many others end up getting successfully up the elevator. Then, it's Valentine's turn. However, the elevator is becoming increasingly unstable. Which, by the way, I just want to mention real quick, the waiter who's following them, I forgot to mention, is also the person that was sneaking Elena onto the ship. You'll see this be a bit sad later. Valentine begins to cross, but as he does, he offers to let Nelson go first, so they switch places, and they actually talk quite a bit during this, so they kind of get to know each other. But as Nelson grabs Dylan, the elevator falls down again, sending vibrations that fall the ladder down below. The table then falls and gets impaled down below. Valentine is now hanging by Nelson's leg, and Nelson is about to fall. Ramsey goes back and anchors Dylan's leg so that at least he won't fall with them, but they can't pull both of them up. They try to rescue him, but the elevator is about to fall on them, so Dylan tells Nelson to kick him off and to let him fall, or they'll both die. Nelson, apologizing a lot, does exactly that, and kicks Valentine off. Valentine then falls and is impaled on the bottom of the elevator shaft, but Nelson is saved. And that is why I had nightmares for weeks after watching this movie for the first time. And after another trademark random Posiedon explosion, everything in the ballroom begins to shake. However, the doors are sealed so that no fire will be able to get in. Nelson opens the door again to look down at the fire. He is thankful to be alive, but also, everyone in the group is now realizing that they are not going to be able to save everyone down there. Back in the nightclub, Jenny and Elena are trying to get Chris out of his predicament, however, he's still pinned. So, Lucky Larry grabs a giant speaker, and they put the bar over that in order to get it better. These people definitely do know a thing or two about physics, it seems. Anyways, They end up lifting it, but they can't get it out. But after a few tries, Chris is able to be freed. As they're walking out, Jenny sees a familiar figure and realizes that Ramsey has arrived, and after a short reunion, they end up trying to heal Chris. Ramsey thanks Chris for saving Jenny, but then Chris says that Jenny saved him, referring to him as Sir. As you'll see in this movie, he never refers to Ramsey by his actual name. Nelson finds Elena, who was Valentine's partner, and gives her some water. He introduces himself to her and tells her that the situation is very, very bad, also making a joke that the only thing they have a lot of around there is water. He then asks Elena if she's traveling with anyone, and she says yes, he was really nice, never knowing that it was the guy that he killed. This is the very sad irony I was talking about, where Elena and Nelson know each other, but Nelson will never figure out Elena's true backstory and who she was traveling with. Anyways, Dylan finds the door and ends up staring at it. Connor joins in and asks what he's doing. He says that he's thinking. Connor says he's also thinking. But Dylan asks, "Do you think this is the way out?" To which Connor reaches for the door and Dylan immediately stops him, saying that it could be extremely hot. He then pours some water over it, and steam comes off the door, signifying that it is indeed extremely hot. Ramsey and Dylan then decide to pull the door open with a broom, and then shoot a fire extinguisher at it. I guess this is the only signifier that Ramsey used to be a fireman. Anyways, the room ends up being empty with no fire, meaning that it was a flash fire. Elena then goes over to Jenny and says that she thinks he knows her dad from somewhere. Jenny then says that her dad used to be the mayor of New York. Elena says, "That's so cool," and Jenny replies, "It wasn't." They eventually find the atrium, but it's all bashed up, and it's flooding down below from the glass that broke. Elena says that this is the only way through, but before they can make a decision, Chris decides to jump the gun and starts climbing across the elevator that has been wedged in between the atrium. It apparently is stable enough to hold, so he tells them to start sending people. They send most people across, but then Lucky Larry barges in and starts taunting Ramsey for his former job as the mayor of New York, having lost that election and also losing his wife. Man, I sure hope that's a story that'll be developed throughout the movie. Anyways, he eventually tells Ramsey to come and fight him, but they stop him and allow him to go first. But as he's climbing across, he has some alcohol in his hand, and drops it clumsily. After that, though, strange shooting sounds are heard from the roof, which used to be the floor, and an engine comes bashing through the floor of the Posiedon, crushing Lucky Larry and the bridge across the atrium. Oil and fuel begins boiling after it, and lights on fire. So now, with Dylan, Ramsey, and Jenny still on the other side, they say that they have to go back down and find a way across. Although personally, looking at the atrium, I can find about a million ways that they could get across. Dylan eventually decides, after some arguing, that the best way to do so is to grab a fire hose, jump across, and tie it on the other end. However, before that, Jenny reveals the reason she can't split up with Chris in this adventure is because Chris asked her to marry him, and she accepted, so she wants to stay with him. But he has to tell her that there's another way across. Until, of course, Dylan jumps across and makes the tightrope. After some scenes where they talk about Jenny not being able to find her way to school even though they lived a block away, they eventually zipline across. And hey, I know I've been talking about exposition for this entire movie, but this really isn't what I had in mind. Ramsey and Jenny eventually get across successfully, and Dylan says, "Wanna hit me now?" And Ramsey replies, "Well, you're actually doing alright." However, their problems aren't entirely over because it's random Posiedon explosion time, and with this explosion, it begins sending water rapidly into the atrium, so the water is now chasing after them extremely fast. However, this explosion also breaks a few windows in the ballroom, meaning that it is about to flood. Eventually, everyone begins to realize that they should have just gone with the other group, and that not staying there would have probably saved their lives. They try to open the doors, however, water has already flooded the areas outside. The windows eventually break, causing the room to flood and everyone to die. I do notice something with Poseidon movies, though. In real life, when a ship starts sinking, you should follow the instructions of crew. However, in all of the Poseidon movies, the lesson seems to be the exact opposite. While that has saved people in the past, I don't know how good of a message this is for a movie like this. Anyways, the people in the atrium can hear what is going on in the ballroom and they know exactly what happened. After taking it all in, they begin to move, as water has begun going up the atrium. Find flashlights and try to find some way to get out. They find a bulkhead door, however, when they open the door, water comes pouring through. Eventually, a wall of water begins rushing towards them, but there is a small amount of hope. They end up finding a vent that leads upwards. Elena is terrified of going in that vent, but Ramsey says that it is their only way of getting up, and so goes in without a second thought, with Chris following right behind him. Eventually, Ramsey finds that it does indeed go up quite a ways, however, there's a dent in the middle that'll make it a bit difficult to go through. I don't actually know how they ended up getting from horizontal to vertical in this shaft, because it feels a bit too tight for that, but still. Dylan tries to convince Elena to get in the vent as she is extremely claustrophobic. However, she freaks out and says she won't go in. Then, Nelson says that if she doesn't go, he doesn't go. So, Dylan, having enough of it, basically shoves her in the vent, with Nelson grabbing her by her hands. In the vent, Elena freaks out and tells them to get her out. However, Nelson calms her down and tells her to grab his foot and just follow him. Ramsey gets to the top of the vent, however, there are screwdrivers holding the vent down, and there's no way to get it busted open. So, he calls Dylan up and sees if he can unscrew the screws. Nelson starts climbing through the tight dented parts, but as he does, he falls back down and gets stuck, with Elena freaking out and trying to go back down again. Dylan then calms her down and asks her if she has a little brother. Elena then says that the reason she stowed away on the ship was because her brother is in a hospital in New York and she didn't have enough money to go and see him. Dylan then makes a promise with Elena that she'll get to see him, which will become a bit sad later. Elena takes a deep breath and moves up to push Nelson's foot. Eventually, he budges and is able to be freed and starts climbing again. Meanwhile, at the top though, Connor, with his tiny hands, cannot unscrew the screwdriver. So, they ask if anyone has something that can act as a screwdriver to get the screw out. Elena then takes her Christian cross necklace and gives it to Connor to use. However, time is running out, and eventually, Dylan gets completely submerged. But just as Dylan is submerged, the hatch finally budges and everyone is able to get out of the vent into the ballasts of the ships, which is basically where they put water into to make the ship more stable. And no, they're not about to flood the ballast so that they can flip the ship over. They begin looking for a way out next. They find another vent, but also a hatch on the roof that used to be the floor. Chris jumps on it and they twist him and eventually get it open, climbing up the vent. They then find the hatch leads to the actual proper ballast. Dylan then tells them that these rooms are used to keep the ship stable, and that a hatch on there will open if enough pressure is applied. I don't actually know if these exist in real life, so please tell me in the comments if this is how ballasts work. Anyways, Dylan says that they need to flood the entire room and let the pressure carry them across. Ramsey eventually sees that water is flooding the previous room, so closes the hatch and tells Dylan that he better be right, because there's no other way that they can get out. Dylan twists the valve and the ballast begins being flooded. As it is, people begin to take breaths and go underwater. Then, in a scene that honestly makes me hold my breath every single time, even though I'm not underwater, which is one thing that I do not like about the Poseidon movies, the ballast hatch finally opens and they go to the next room, but Dylan looks down and sees that there's a hallway. He doesn't know how far it is, but he says that it's the only other way to go through, so they begin swimming. Chris eventually takes Connor because he was a swimmer in high school, which I find it weird that every single Poseidon movie has to have a professional swimmer in high school. In the last two movies it was Mrs. Rosen, but because the closest thing to a Mrs. Rosen character is Nelson, and Nelson isn't exactly as helpful, eventually in this movie, Chris is the one that takes on that role. Anyways, in yet another scene that makes me hold my breath every time I watch it, they eventually find some stairs that lead up. However, as Elena is swimming, her hair gets caught on some electrical wire, and she's pulled back. She struggles, but eventually bangs her head on some metal, injuring her. Nelson goes back to try to save Elena, but there's no use, because at this point she's already lost enough blood that there's no way a human could actually survive with losing that much. They bring Elena back up to the end where the air is, and try to perform CPR on her, but after a few tries, there's no use. They've lost another one. This loss is especially sad considering her whole thing with Valentine, and how Nelson never knew that Valentine was the one that brought her on board, and that he accidentally killed him, and now has lost Elena too. They put her necklace back on, and continue up. Afterwards, they climb the stairs on the shaft they found themselves in, but as they do, the ballasts from before begin flooding, and they go from one tank to the next, causing the bow of the ship to begin going down, meaning that the side thrusters what they're planning to get out of are now underwater. However, upon reaching the top, there is a long shaft, but it's partly blocked by a ton of debris. But then, Ramsey hears something. Everyone pauses and listens. They hear a soft knocking from the other side. They think it's rescuers and began yelling to clear all of the debris. However, Ramsey gets to the other side and sees that it's just something banging against metal. They end up finding the long shaft, mainly used by crew before the ship capsized to get around quickly, so this is the perfect place for them to be. However, they find deck plans of the ship on the wall. Dylan says that down the corridor is where the bow thruster room is. In there's an access hatch that leads into the tubes, and the only thing between them and the outside is nothing. However, I don't know how real it is to have tubes inside of bow thrusters with access hatches. Once again, someone with more experience can tell me in the comments, and I'll put that on Rules of Navigation, but still. But when they get to the hallway, they see water and realize the ship is tilting toward the bow, and the bow is underwater, so there's no way to get into that room. Feeling demotivated, Ramsey tells them to go back, regroup, and they'll find another way out. But because now is such a great time for a random Poseidon explosion. In the back little dome area of the ship, random explosions begin, and this will cause a lot later. In the crew rest area, everyone is chilling and kind of just thinking about how they can get out, but Dylan is pretty demotivated and sort of just not trying anymore. However, Ramsey comforts him and tells him that even if not everyone was able to survive, he did all he could, and he gave everyone a chance, and that's what matters. He could have just gone it alone like he said, but he ended up helping everyone, and they made it very, very far. But those previous explosions I just mentioned ended up sending the stern of the ship into the air. Then, more random Poseidon explosions in the engine room end up sinking the stern of the ship, meaning the bow is now above the water. But then, inside, Maggie realizes Connor is completely missing, so goes into the hallway to find him, only to immediately get swept up by a wall of water, and pushed over to the back of the ship, with the bow of the ship rising even faster out of the water due to the free surface effect. Ramsey goes up to help the others get out of the front, but Dylan stays behind to find Maggie and Connor. They take one last look at each other and go their separate ways. Dylan finds Maggie at the end of the hallway, scared and completely worried about where Connor is, so they go to try to find him. Then, everyone in the front climbs a ladder, and they end up making it into the bow thruster room. I do not know if in real life ships have an entire control room dedicated to the bow thrusters, but in a way it sort of does make sense. Nelson goes to open the hatch, not realizing the bow thrusters are still moving. People tell him not to, but the door blows open and hits him straight in the face. Due to the fact the bow thrusters were turned on just before the ship was hit, they are still on now, meaning that they are blowing air into the room instead of creating suction, and they are not out, meaning they have to stop the bow thrusters. Meanwhile, Dylan and Maggie end up finding Connor. However, there's no easy way to get to him. In the front, Ramsey finds the way to the bow thruster control room and goes to tell Chris. He explains to them, though, that it's far away enough that whoever goes to turn off the bow thrusters can't possibly come back and survive. Chris says that there's gotta be a way that they can make it back, and suggests throwing things into the bow thrusters, but with the air going back, it'll just blow everything back towards them. So, one of them needs to swim. Maggie and Dylan find Connor in the back of the ship, but he's stuck behind a grate and he doesn't know how he got there. Dylan tries to find a way to enter, but can't. Ramsey begins to go, but Jenny doesn't want him to go, knowing that he probably will not come back. Chris suggests then that he will go instead, that he was a swimmer in high school, but Ramsey says no, he'll just die. Ramsey says that it's got to be one of them, they can't not go. Jenny, terrified by this, walks away, and Ramsey says to Chris, "Thank you for everything." Chris just says yeah, and goes over to comfort Jenny, telling him that the only thing he needs to hear right now is that she loves him. But before she can say that, they turn around, and Ramsey is gone. Ramsey swims down a long way, following the corridor he saw on the map, and eventually finds the room. In the back of the ship, the water keeps rising, and Dylan keeps trying to see if he can find a way to rescue Connor, but he doesn't see how he got there, and Connor doesn't know either. Eventually, the water rises so much that Connor and Maggie can't breathe anymore. Well, at least Connor can't. Maggie stays with him until Connor is pulled away by something. Ramsey gets into the control room, however, he's losing air fast and needs to find the button to turn off the bow thrusters. He tries to press the button to turn off the bow thrusters, but it's broken, and he ends up just breaking it more. He finds the button to reverse it, but he's running out of breath, and after a shockingly real depiction of drowning, he looks at the button and realizes if he reverses the bow thrusters, then they can throw junk into it. So, he pushes the button to make the bow thrusters go to port. In real life, though, this wouldn't work, because one bow thruster is pushing behind, another is pushing in front, in order to make the ship go the way it's going, because most bow thrusters have two propellers at each end, notably the ones in this movie do. Maggie, still hoping Connor can be found, sees Dylan resurface, and he's holding Connor. He's been able to save him. Everyone at the bow thruster room begins to notice the bow thrusters reversing, and they realize what he did. Also, for some reason, things began falling off the ship, like the cover for the pool and parts of the funnel. Anyways, Dylan, Maggie, and Connor eventually find their way into the bow thruster room. They ask where's Ramsey, to which Chris explains that he wouldn't let him go, and that he tried to turn off the thrusters. Dylan asks why they're still going, and then they realize that Ramsey reversed the engines. Chris then gives a giant flammable tank to Dylan to throw in there and to blow up the engines. Dylan then throws the big tank toward it, but it's stuck sideways. The only way to get it unlodged is for him to go there too. After one last look at the people he's saved, he lets go and is also stuck diagonally inside the little hatch. Dylan pushes the tank with all his might, trying to get it to go in, but it won't budge. However, he eventually gets it, and the tank flies into the propeller tube, blowing up the side thrusters, and allowing them to get out. Dylan begins lifting people up to go into the thruster room, and, one by one, they begin to climb out of the ship. Jenny stays at the hatch where her dad went down, but there's no one coming, and Chris comforts her, telling her that they need to go or else they'll join him. The group finally get into the propeller tubes, and look out, being able to see the open sky and the ocean for the first time in a long time. With air being able to escape now, the ship is rapidly sinking, so they begin jumping, and they finally escape the Poseidon. Nelson too even jumps headfirst, despite the fact he's very much injured. They find a life raft floating, and yes, this is realistic, because life rafts do indeed automatically deploy if they are submerged in water. Only unrealistic thing is why this life raft doesn't have a roof over it. But as soon as they get into the life raft, they realize that the ship is defying all laws of physics and flipping over and is going to crush them if they are not careful. So they begin paddling for dear life away from the ship in a very not efficient manner. Seriously, I get that it's a disaster movie, but they could at least paddle a little bit better. The ship defies all laws of physics and flips over, releasing a giant wave that washes up their raft. Then, the Poseidon finally begins to sink, in yet another scene that is absolutely eye candy. Even if it's not realistic, the scene looks amazing. This scene has kind of become iconic in the ship community, just because it's always so cool to see a very real-looking sinking in a movie. Even if the way the physics work isn't entirely realistic, the scene does look absolutely awesome to watch. Everyone is now able to sit back, lay down, and sit as they watch the ship that they just escaped from go down, realizing that there are probably still people in there. Then, finally, after a long time, the Poseidon takes her final plunge. And we get another amazing shot of the ship sinking underwater, with the power finally going out. Back in the life raft, Dylan finds a survival box with a flare gun in it, so he loads it and shoots it into the sky. The hard part of escaping the ship might be over, but now comes the long part, waiting for rescue. However, in yet another unrealistic part of this movie, helicopters appear almost immediately after the flare is launched. I guess the EPIRBs really did work. Everyone is celebrating the fact that, even though it was difficult, they did it, and they survived the Poseidon sinking. Everyone starts waving and celebrating, waiting for the helicopters to put their spotlight on. Then, in another amazing shot, we see them highlight a ton of debris in the water, realizing that they have reached the site of the sinking. Then, one helicopter's spotlight passes right over the life raft, and they both put their spotlights on. Then, as the camera zooms out, we see 3 ships on the horizon. And, in one final amazing shot, the movie is now over. And that was Poseidon. So, now that we're done with that, let's actually talk about how this movie was made, and a bit more of the behind the scenes, as well as a bit more about the true star of the show, the Posiedon. But I thought it's best to get someone who knows a little bit more about film in here to talk about the true stars of the show.
Why, hello there, sailors. My name and my channel name is Matthew S. Richards, though you can also find me at my handle titled Man Who Loves the Mary. I have several series on my channel. One of them is titled Great Ships of Cinema, where I review movies and other forms of media that feature the great ships of the sea, both new as well as old. Majoring with a BA in cinema arts, the series reflects my experience and love of film from a ship enthusiast's point of view. I just completed one on Buster Keaton's 1924 silent blockbuster The Navigator, so check that one out right after this one if you feel so inclined for a dramatic voyage of slapstick as well as deeply moving proportions. Now, I actually saw Posiedon in theaters when it first came out. I was very young at the time, and I was so excited and enticed by the dramatic trailers featuring an original mega cruise ship / potential ocean liner that resembled Queen Mary 2, as she was not only brand new and the biggest ship in the world, but also all the rage at the time. Except that this ship, Posiedon, was indeed a ship all its own. This added a lot of ethos to the credibility of the film to me. My thought process was that maybe this movie would be a really cool modern update the way the 1997 Parent Trap remake with Lindsay Lohan was to the original 1961 Haley Mills classic. A fresh retelling that does not pretentiously try to be better or more flashy than the original, but in fact honors the original and even gives some throwbacks, to the point of being called an adaptation rather than a remake. I was happy to see that the new Posiedon was this honorable adaptation I so trusted it would be. The 1970s is reported to have been a very divided and divisive time, and no better do we see this illustrated than in the original Posiedon adventure. Controversy on every level is presented in this very rugged film all about survival, working together, and the ongoing debate over faith and God's provision versus the self-reliant human nature. Both movies cover this topic, but both in very different ways, or slightly different ways at least. The 1972 version appears to blame God for the struggle of humankind's grinding self-reliance, asking where God is, whereas the 2006 version more subtly uses one female character to depict Christians as weak and easily faltering. This character does not survive long. It's interesting that both of these films come out during a very divided and controversial time actually. 9/11 occurred only 5 years earlier, and you can really feel it in some ways in this depiction. This grand humongous structure of brilliant human engineering named after the god of the sea cannot stand against Mother Nature. Whereas the 1972 film struggles against the relationship between God and man, the 2006 version appears to struggle against the relationship between man and nature. Also, man versus man, seeming to favor and illustrate the Darwinistic theory of survival of the fittest. For example, mercilessly, though not without reason, in one scene, the top of the human rope, if you will, in what may be the ship's funnel hatch, commands that they let go of the bottom of the human rope, who is desperately pleading to be kept on. The dilemma is that either one falls, or else they all fall. This scene admittedly haunts me to this day, and maybe that was exactly their intention, forcing you to question the value of human life. What would you do in this situation? What may be considered the most trendy difference between the two movies is in the title itself. Instead of an almost playful sounding name, by today's standards at least, like The Posiedon Adventure, the popular thing to do in the early thousands was to streamline, so as to make some things sound really very intense, steep, and significant. Hence, Posiedon stood on its own. While I do prefer the more complex exploration of deep interpersonal and existential matters in the original 1972 version, whereas the 2006 version seems a little bit more merciless, animalistic, and perhaps a little rushed, one thing I do like better about the 2006 depiction is how much they focus on the ship itself. Whereas the original uses a carbon copy of the once famous and world-renowned Queen Mary, now preserved as a hotel and tourist attraction in Long Beach, California, the renamed 1972 Posiedon acts, I feel, as more of a catalyst for the story. Whereas, as stated previously, the 2006 Posiedon is a ship all its own. And a lot of painstaking detail went into her design and concept, to the point where there are models of the fictional ship that people both purchase and outright build from scratch. There are full-on detailed deck plans of this otherwise fictional floating resort. Even after close to 2 decades of advanced technology and the ever-increasing size of cruise ships, I feel the 2006 Posiedon, with potential modern safety and amenity features, could still easily be built today. So, while I prefer the 1972 version, I respect some of the ways they specialized the 2006 version and made it all its own. If you would like to check out my channel, links to it are in the description below. Thank you, Ocean, for including me in this almost literal movie deep dive, and happy, preferably rogue waveless, sailing.
Thanks, Matthew, for that. I actually did not know about the physical models of this ship you can get, but hey, maybe I'll use my ad revenue to get that. Like the video. Although maybe not this one, because if you look closely at it, especially at the back of the ship, there's just so much wrong. I mean, there's an entire deck that doesn't exist on the real ship. there's no dome, and there's 2 pools. One of them is crammed into this little area. Although I will admit I do like the stern on this boat more than the movie one, I still would like one that's more accurate. Anyways, on to the actual movie. There was an entire behind-the-scenes documentary made about this movie, and it reveals some really cool things. For one, that scene where Josh Lucas swims under the fire was never originally planned. Upon seeing the set, the actor really wanted to swim under fire, so every day after he was done his scenes, he would go home and he would swim back and forth in his pool for hours. Eventually, Wolfgang Petersen edited the script and allowed him to jump down and swim under the fire, which explains why that scene feels like it was just added later, but I do think it was to the benefit of that movie because Josh Lucas was right. It looked really cool. I will also say that this movie is incredible when it comes to its CG, and it actually used some of the most advanced computers for the time, and by most advanced computers for the time, I mean 2006 most advanced computers of the time. But all jokes aside, the CG in this movie is really great, and the film was actually nominated for Best Academy Award for Visual Effects, but it lost to Pirates of the Caribbean. However, the movie's reception wasn't exactly good. A lot of people said that the movie had a B at best, and that Wolfgang Petersen's heart was not in this movie. I mean, it was his last movie, so who knows, maybe he was just tired of movies by then. It scored an average of 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, which has then decreased to 33%. And it was actually nominated for a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Remake of the Year, losing to another movie called Little Man. A lot of people said that the movie relies too much on its visuals and not enough on storytelling, which is a fair criticism, but honestly I still really like the movie. I do also find it incredible that all of the giant sets you see in the movie are not CG, for the most part. They are real. For example, the giant atrium with the fire previously mentioned, that's real. The ballroom, they actually flipped that. A lot of this movie is not CG, but when it is CG, it's pretty great. Onto the ship though, they mention one of the reasons they didn't use a real ship is because they were only going to be upright for 10 minutes, and then they'd be flipping the ship over. And they thought that for some reason, cruise companies would not appreciate them flipping their ship over. They did actually get a yes from some companies about flipping a ship over, but it would have been a much smaller ship than what they needed, so they decided to make a fictional one. And, actually, although it's never explicitly mentioned anywhere, they did design the ship based off the Queen Mary II, which, like I said, not mentioned anywhere, but it is implied everywhere. For example, there's a storyboard of the Queen Mary II being flipped over, and one of the people who designed the ship literally has a model of the Queen Mary II sitting beside him in the documentary. So, I don't think it's much of a secret that this was based off the Queen Mary II, which does make sense considering that this is an ocean liner, and at the time, the Queen Mary II was the biggest ship in the world. I will also say it does make a lot of sense to copy the Queen Mary II, because the original movie blatantly copied the Queen Mary, so it's a nice throwback to the original. However, Wolfgang Petersen says that although he loves the original characters from the Posiedon adventure, he wanted to change things up. And, interestingly enough, while I was digging around, I found out that this movie was originally going to be called The Posiedon Adventure 2, in an old storyboard where it has that title at the top. But this was changed because there were already 2 movies called that. Also, these photos of the Queen Mary II are kindly provided by Matthew S. Richards as well, so thank you for them. And according to Final Cut Pro, it says that he actually saw this ship right around the time the movie came out, ironically enough, during a visit where the Queen Mary II saw its original predecessor, for the first and only time. In terms of fictional ships, the Posiedon is actually probably my favorite, just because it looks so darn cool. But I will say though, there are quite a few issues with it. For example, the bridge wings do not extend over the side of the ship, which I feel like would be an issue, and also, there's no navigation lights. That just confuses me every single time how they missed that. But still, overall, really nice design, and I do want to get a model of it someday. Looking into the history of how this movie was made is very interesting, though, and I do think that it probably must have been pretty exciting for ship fans that they ended up getting 2 Poseidon movies in 2 years, which must have been pretty crazy. I do not think that it went to waste, though, and I do think that it is one of the best Poseidon movies. Although, talking about that real quick, I do not know where to rank this movie. In fact, I don't know where to rank any of the Poseidon movies. All 3 of them, no not that one, are great movies, and I do definitely love all of them. And they all have their certain specialties. If you want to get someone introduced to the Poseidon movies, I would say first to start with this movie because it's the best for modern audiences. Then show them the 1972 version if they're like older movies, as the 1972 version is definitely a lot slower. Then, after that, if they really like both of those movies, or if they're just a ship fan, show them the 2005 one. It's quite long and does take a lot to get invested in, but all of them are really great movies in their own right, and I don't think I can really rank them. I don't exactly remember what year I got interested in the Posiedon, but I do remember it was with this video, Posiedon Sinking, or some sort of video like this, because I remember watching this video long before it was published 6 years ago. You see, this video was uploaded in 2018, but I moved away from my house in Lantau Island in 2017, but I very vividly remember discovering this movie in my Lantau house while watching a video called Posiedon Sinking, and I'm pretty sure it was this video. So either I'm having a Mandela effect and I predicted this video would come out later, or it was another video that was deleted then re-uploaded. But either way, this video got really popular and is what introduced me to this movie. I was immediately intrigued and watched the full thing soon after downloading it from Pirate Bay, which was also the exact same thing I did to get the movie for this video. In general though, I've grown a fond fascination with this movie, and I know it's a favorite among ship enthusiasts for a good reason. It's a really good movie for ship enthusiasts, and the ship itself is just really cool. And with that basically concludes my Poseidon review video series. Like I said, I will review Beyond the Poseidon Adventure if any of the 3 videos get over 1,000 likes, but since I don't think that's gonna happen anytime soon, thank you for watching this series for the past 3 years. It's been my most popular series on the channel by far, and I can't wait to show you guys some other stuff that I have coming, and I hope that you'll stick around for more stuff. I might do more movie reviews in the future, so suggest ones and I'll take a look at them. So, what is an architect supposed to do during a ship sinking? Which company owns the Poseidon? And are these movies secretly connected? That's a very good question.